I like it.
Yeah.
Let's say the French version. To the talk today. I'm on behalf of GMAP. I'm very happy to introduce to you Doug Irvin Erickson, who's a legal historian and political theorist. Doug specializes in 20th and 21st century history of international criminal law and human rights, and he teaches classes on peace, conflict resolution, genocide prevention, and human rights at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, where he's also the director of the Raphael Lemkin Genocide Prevention Program. He has a long CV, which I won't go into here, but I think for me anyway, the highlight for me is the book Raphael Lemkin and the Concept of Genocide. Is it how I got that?
Yes.
Which was I think 2017, which is the definitive intellectual biography and legal history of the Lemkin and Genocide Convention. So we're delighted to have Doug with us. It's great to see you here. Thank you so much for coming. The title of the talk is right on the board, so I don't need to read it to you today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Doug Irvin Erickson.
So I first of all want to say thank you to the search committee. Really, everything that you've done to the interview process has been pleasurable and a joy, and my trip here to Binghamton has been fantastic. And Max, I know that as the chair of the committee, you have the extra responsibility of making sure itineraries work out. And thank you for everything. Thank you everyone for shepherding me here and welcoming me. I had thought I would start with a little icebreaker, some pictures, but I'm gonna, as I was going throughout the day, I realized that I want to spend my time a little differently. So we'll do the icebreaker in the middle. But this title, so the presentation is titled Genocide Prevention Futures, Contested Histories and Contradictory Practices and Movements to Build Peace and Prevent Genocide. Now, if anybody has any suggestions on better titles, please. please email me with all suggestions. This is taken from what is going to be chapter 4 of the book that I'm working on, which has an equally non-appealing title to publishers. So I will take all constructive criticism that you've got. So, but before we get to that book, which is sort of the conceptual art of this presentation, I'm going to spend some time talking about who I am as a scholar, and my hope is to sort of contextualize this. So this is a picture of Bujumbura, the airport in Burundi, capital Burundi. And every time I've flown there, there's UN or an African Union transport jet unloading and offloading peacekeepers. And I wanted to lean into the contradictory practices here for a moment. And I think this picture crystallizes a lot of the contradictory practices that we see around efforts to prevent genocide and build peace. What I mean by that is during interviews with a colleague who some of you actually know, who was here, he's a practitioner resident, David Maramba. We had met with the US-backed rebel leader who was in Congo at the time. Now you put down your guns and you're a political party, you pick up your guns and you're a rebel group. That's sort of how politics works in this particular context. And this individual sort of had this quote, which was really, really insightful, deceptively. The international community lectures us about peace and human rights, but pays us to kill. And what they meant by that, what he meant by that was two things. First was those peacekeepers, because this is like something astronomical. I have to figure out how to actually find the right data with just get it. But the numbers that I'm seeing go from 50% to 70% of all wages earned in the Burundian economy come from peacekeeping. So the UN and the African Union are the largest employers in the country. And then there's a second meaning behind this, which is that he's the US-backed opposition party leader. And so the US pays him a lot. And there's a Belgian-backed opposition party, there's a French-backed, there's a Russian-backed, there's a Chinese-backed. And pretty soon you can begin to see that the same governments that are funding human rights and genocide prevention work and peacekeeping are also the same governments that are funding warfare and violence. And I think that's something that we need to think about. And it's important, I think, for us to be aware of this and criticize it. So the talk today is sort of divided here into 3 parts. I have, in the first part, sort of a bio. The second part, I'm talking about 3 streams of my scholarship. This has to do with my past work, and then my current projects. I hope it becomes evident that I've succeeded in my job to really show that my current projects are in a lot of ways expansions of my previous work. Now I'm not going to talk about the US in the talk, so I put some pictures here. This is a picture of Eastern State Penitentiary outside Philadelphia. And this is a picture of Switzerland Prison in Cambodia. And I just submitted a manuscript, just finished an article. We're going to submit it my co-author. That's using the genocide prevention literature to help us understand the prevention, to theorize mass incarceration in the US. And it's going to be the first of 3 articles we write together that's attempting to help bridge the gap between the genocide studies and prevention literature and the abolition literature. And if you look at this sign here, right, back to contradictory practices, right, this sign is very proud. This is like a really proud historical marker. This prison was where these advanced progressive scientists in the science of penology, that isn't flourished, linked solitude with moral and vocational instruction. Right? And doesn't that sound, for those of you who know the Cambodian genocide, that's what Khmer Rouge did that too. They linked prison with moral instruction. So there's a kind of a thread of my scholarship that I have a PhD in global affairs, which allows me to ignore nation states as an my analysis. But there really are some global practices that I think sort of define my work and my approach. And one of them actually is sort of, around the global practice of prisons and memory. So anyway, that's there. So in terms of genocide prevention education, I teach these classes at Carter School. I taught a whole other set of classes around human rights. Taught a class about conflicts at the Holocaust Museum. And for several years I worked, I really enjoyed this experience at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. This was a faculty training I co-led the museum's faculty training seminars in the summer for Holocaust education. And in 2019, before that, I was part of a team with a former student of mine to create the Foreign Service Institute's curriculum for mass atrocity prevention. And FSI is where the US trains its foreign affairs officers. And there's one person in that room who has actually experienced that curriculum. It's part of the class that I taught at children's. I see this as sort of intimately connected to the practitioner worlds that have engaged in different ways. I can talk more about this later. It sort of comes up significantly in future slides. But most importantly, my research agenda over the last few years, 10 years maybe, has really coincided with these questions of education and practice around genocide prevention. And the book that I'm writing now really is trying to figure out how we bridge the gap between the theory and practice of genocide prevention. There's another kind of question that emerges, which I've been playing around with in some books, Wicked Problems, the introduction to that, review and perspective of politics, call it a kick in the gut. All right. But really is this question of does, I articulated this in the intro, I'll say it again, does the field of genocide studies and prevention actually contribute to a more peaceful world? And I think that's something that has to be embraced. I don't think we can just assume that what we teach naturally causes the world to be better. And then there's this other question hanging out, which is a long-term question of mine, which is where do our institutions come from, and the norms come from, and why does this matter? So the first stream of my research, and sort of primary research into three main streams, it's around justice processes. I should have put here justice processes and peace processes. That's really what I'm interested about. This work began when I was working in Cambodia, the Documentation Center of Cambodia, which is really an NGO that emerged from the Yale History Department, became an independent NGO to preserve and document the Cameroon genocide, contested organization. And then I also got interested in the question of how these international institutions were playing out in Cambodian courts. And this actually became a puzzle for me that I decided that I was going to do my doctoral work on. Right? And so Cambodia had two justice processes. One was backed by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese kicked the Khmer Rouge out of power. The other was backed by the United Nations. And both of these genocide prosecutions, so the Vietnamese trials convicted Pol Pot of genocide. The verdicts came out in the 1980s, early 80s. Both of these trials are international trials backed by foreign powers to some degree that take place in the local Cambodian courts, using Cambodian law that dates back to 1950 that Raphael Lemkin helped write. So these are actually domestic prosecutions in a lot of ways. And so the question for me became, well, Cambodia's had two of these processes. How come one's seen as legitimate, the other's not? Right? How do we know which one worked for Cambodia? What is Cambodia? Maybe the authentic Cambodian experience is having foreign powers mess around in your domestic conflicts. And that's what sort of led me to, to this puzzle, trying to understand that there's all these incredible different cultural contexts. International law is being interpreted and applied, where courts have sort of, different national context, cultural context, historical context, political context for sure. And sort of the beginning of the stream of my work really was a question of where did the Genocide Convention come from? And where did this idea come from? And that, to me, demanded an understanding of the person who coined the word. But then lo and behold, you realize that the word just doesn't appear in Lemkin's thought magically. He coins the word genocide. There's a long intellectual history here. And it's actually deep and rich. And so the book became part diplomatic history of the Genocide Convention, part intellectual history of genocide, and then part intellectual biography of Raphael Lemkin, the sources I used here. I'm going to resist the temptation to talk for an hour about this book and taking a whole bunch of slides in the appendix. We could get into the fun part about that later if you want to in the Q&A. But there's some things here in the book that set up my current research. I want to talk about the research. The first is, I'm not sure, it's probably hard to read from the back. I can read it. So the first thing that I want to really call out here is that the book is taking, Lemkin in his League of Nations years and explaining the work he was doing on economic law. He was a tax lawyer. but also the work that his first two books are about the Soviet Union, in which he conceives of the Soviet Penal Code as imagining of political enemies as national enemies, and then sets out the violence of the state towards the destruction of what is called national enemies. So there's a kind of element to genocide that's present when he's writing his first books in his 20s on the Soviet Penal Code. In 1920, after he writes two books on the Soviet and then the Russian Penal Code, he writes a book on Italian fascism. And then he goes from there into international commerce law, talking about all sorts of interesting things. So in the third chapter, which is the book on Axis rule in occupied Europe, the text in which genocide first appears in print, we see that entire system of thinking at work in his analysis of the Holocaust. Right? So he's transferred over this work that he's been doing in the interwar years, and transferred that over and applies it. And there's some things that are really kind of crucial here. The first is that we now understand genocide to be colloquially a synonym for mass murder. Right? And then non-colloquially, we kind of understand it in the connection to the final solution in the Holocaust. But the word genocide was coined in 1941, and the appendix, I have the paper, Lincoln wrote it, which is long before the final solution. And people have said, well, but archivists drop papers, and then when they put them back, they put them in other places. Like, well, okay, but the pad of paper that he wrote on's got other dates from 1941. Well, that's not enough, okay. Well, he submitted his book manuscript early in 1942 to the publisher, which is still before the final solution. It takes 2 years for the book to get published. And so that's the first question there. How did this concept of genocide move into a synonym for the final solution when the word genocide predates the final solution? So if you were able to read this up close, you'd see that killing is actually very little to do with this concept of genocide. Very, very little. He said generally, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. Now, in this footnote, and then another, he talks about the destruction of national feelings of religion and culture. In a footnote here, he talks about nations, he defines them so broadly, they can mean card players or gamblers. The state can commit genocide against gamblers. Right? Well, this brings us back to the Soviet penal codes and the application of violence towards the destruction of enemy consciousness that the regime doesn't like. Now here, he called genocide a colonial crime. Imagine how that played at the UN, right? Where he says genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national patterns of the oppressed. Two, the imposition of the national patterns of the oppressor, right? Which could happen by by the oppressor allowing everybody to remain alive in a program of colonization. Right? So my question then becomes, okay, so how did this act of genocide change? But then there's this little remarkable hook, which is that there's prosecutions of genocide before the Nuremberg tribunals and the Polish Supreme Courts. They're using this definition of genocide. And then this definition of genocide, Lincoln was really, really, really good to friends with Franz Neumann. They were close, they were tight, they were working together in Nuremberg. And there's this fascinating little link where Rel Hilberg is Neumann's star student. And Hilberg, at the end of his life, explains his conversations with Franz Neumann, saying Lincoln had an insight here that all of the other contemporaries who were alive and writing about the Holocaust during the Holocaust missed. There's something in Lincoln's understanding that sets the stage for Hilberg. Right? So I have a whole chapter here on how this book actually influences Holocaust studies, but then you come back and there's a kind of forgetting of Lincoln within Holocaust studies for all sorts of interesting reasons. So what comes, another important part of this book, which sets up my work really presently, is the diplomatic process by which this conception of genocide that Lincoln articulated in Axis rule in occupied Europe turns into the UN Genocide Convention. And I have some slides that allow us to go into it. The short version is that the major powers remove, during the negotiation process, the things that they are doing that they think could be genocide. So you have to remember Stalin is a more important co-author of the definition of genocide than Lincoln is, because Lincoln's not allowed in the negotiating room, but Wyszynski is. And in 1933, Wyszynski had already denounced Lincoln as enemy of the state, right? Which had condemned him to death if he was ever captured by the Soviets. So here's this enemy of the state, and so Putin still lists Lincoln as terrorist literature because the Soviets had in 1933, right? This history is right. the whole parallel universe of it. What Lemkin means, terrorist, right? Anti-Soviet, anti-Russian terrorist. Anyway, so Stalin is really writing this, right? And for me, there's a kind of thing I can talk about the methods later, but you know, you can trace the origins of support for the Genocide Convention to the women's NGO meetings at the UN. But the conversations that they were talking about, forced marriages, forced divorce, outlawing of marriages, and there's this horrible phrase, euphemism for rape, but it's a term that they used in the 1940s called forcible impregnation, imposing measures intended to increase births within a group. None of these things actually make it to the negotiating table. The only thing that survives from negotiation is imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. So abortion is a legal act of genocide, but not rape, which is something that comes up in the ICTR, International Criminal Tribunals. So there's an incredible kind of diplomatic history here, where this idea is that the Genocide Convention has to be signed off by states whose own diplomats and lawyers have said, you're committing genocide. We need a law that allows us to use hard violence. This is a fascinating process. Now, you step back, and you realize that, take a sip of water here. There's a world around Lemkin that views Lemkin as a hero, human rights hero, and views the UN Genocide Convention as sort of this moral document. And this is something in human rights history that happens all the time. There's a sort of narrative that takes over to celebrate the accomplishments, and you better believe their accomplishments, right? That's really hard to get Stalin to agree to a Genocide Convention. And so they are their accomplishments. But Lemkin himself felt that his work was pointless. Right? He ends his life thinking that all of his work in the United Nations went nowhere. That actually made things a lot worse. And he's got this quote here, which is from his memoirs. The Genocide Convention was now in the hands of statesmen, people who lived in perpetual sin with history, who wanted non-enforceable laws with many loopholes so they could treat life like currency in a bank. And he abandons his faith in international law, and he starts working in domestic law with all of these people around the world that he's met. And his goal is to outlaw genocide in the domestic penal codes around the world. And so Egypt and Turkey, some of the first, Cambodia, Argentina, Burma, you have domestic prosecutions in Cambodia and Argentina because of the laws Lemkin helped write. Right? Now there's this second thing that Lemkin is sort of going on with Lemkin, is that he's trying to prosecute Soviet genocides and then French genocides in North Africa against Muslims. This is because during the Genocide Convention negotiations, Egypt and Saudi Arabia were the two closest allies of Lemkin in the negotiating room. The Egyptian delegation was Lemkin's inside partner in these negotiations. So he carries us over. Now you say, wait a second, Lemkin thought international law was pointless. Why is he working to prosecute them at the UN? Because he knew they would go nowhere. He knew there was no chance of prosecution. He did this to raise public awareness. And in this sense, he actually becomes an early practitioner of this 20th century style of human rights advocacy, of raising public awareness, even though you know the courts are going to do nothing with it. So it's a really kind of a fascinating thing he does. So the third stream of my work is around genocide prevention and peacekeeping practice. And you ask, okay, what's the link here? Well, the one thing that I keep coming back to over and over and over again is that the international legal architecture around genocide, around the Genocide Convention, is what brings into existence social space, legal space, but also funding that allows a global genocide prevention civil society to ultimately come into existence. The moral weight of the UN Genocide Convention is probably more significant than the legal importance of this document. Right? And you can actually look at the construction of a global civil society around the idea of this law. And that could actually be, interestingly, more important than any of the court cases that don't get tried because of politics. Secondly, in engaging these communities that sort of come into existence around this legal architecture, I began to realize that there was a massive gap, and massive is an understatement, between what policymakers and practitioners, whether they're legal practitioners or human rights advocates, think they're doing, and the information they think they need, versus what scholars think those practitioners do and need. That became really clear when I was working with the Foreign Service Institute to train US diplomats. So that thread of mine, I got some publications around that thread of it. research profile. But I want to kind of now zero in on some very, very, this is kind of, modest research grants. You can do a lot with a couple $1,000s in Burundi. But a series of grants that we got, Finny and Nimrod and I got to do research in Burundi around genocide prevention. Now, this is the part where you start to scratch your head, how does this guy go from Cambodia to that? It relates to the Holocaust. I remind you of my PhD in global affairs, which gives me permission to just ignore nation states and look at global connections. But then there's also something that is really important, which you learn a lot just by being in some place. And being in Cambodia, you see Ugandans everywhere around international legal processes. And this shows up in really interesting places like Holocaust education. So Uganda has a long and complicated history with the Holocaust, partly because of the Ugandan Jewish community that's there, and partly because the Abiyan dictatorship in the 70s revives all sorts of Nazi iconography. Cambodians, when they come together with Ugandans, recognize some similarities between the fascist movement on the right and then the Pol Pot movement on the left. They have some commonality that they talk to. But then there's also really, really strong connections with Holocaust education, which is interesting. Every meeting of the non-aligned, every summit of the non-aligned movement, you'll see Cambodians and Ugandans purposefully going out of the way to signal cooperation. And then there's all these international spaces that are funded by governments. GAMAC is funded by the Swiss government, specifically to compete with the Australian-funded R2P architecture, because Australia thinks mass atrocity prevention undermines its foreign policy goals in Asia Pacific, and the Swiss think R2P undermines their foreign policy goals. So they fund these two communities, and the two communities, they have their own journals, their own advocacy, their own parallel universes. But anyway, at GAMAC, you see Cambodia and Uganda working closely. You never find Australian foreign policy people, you find Australian academics. You go to the R2P stuff, you find Ugandan and Cambodian academics, but you don't find representatives of the Cambodian government. You'll see the ICTR, they're linked. And then there's this International Conference of the Great Lakes region, extremely important treaty body that's brought into existence for genocide prevention, specifically in the Great Lakes region. And Cambodian civil society leaders like Yu Chang are just in the backdrop constantly. So this becomes a vehicle for me to begin to understand the African Great Lakes region, which is the third book I'm doing. The book I'm writing now, which is my third project. This slide. Hey, yeah, doing pretty good on time. 20 minutes is a timer. Right? If I'm rushing, it's, I can take some time to Q&A and slow down a little bit. So the first current research project I'm doing is a collaborative project with Mark Lambert from Stockholm University Law School. Mark is my co-PI in this project, and I got a Fulbright, but I had to turn it down because of the height of COVID and life was crazy. But we found other ways to sort of bring this into existence because of Zoom, frankly. But then we building a research team around this. The idea is to produce a series of projects that really make the case that international law is alive and well in domestic law all around the world globally. And we're beginning with one of the hardest cases approved, which is U.S. courts. So we're putting together an edited book on this. In the backdrop here, we also are working through this really interesting history, which is that there's been more domestic prosecutions of genocide than there have been international prosecutions of genocide. And that's just an incredible little wrinkle of history that people don't pay attention to, because we place so much more weight on international law, we forget the spaces where it's actually alive and well. This is free of international politics. The Argentine courts are like, we don't care what the Security Council says. We don't care. We're going to do this, right? This is how we interpret this. And so the Argentine courts go back to Lincoln's writings. They say, what did Lincoln mean? We said nations. Right? Let's go back to that. I put an asterisk around Cambodia because it's really an odd one. It's a UN trial in extraordinary chambers and the courts of Cambodia. So legally, it's a domestic court. International law, it's bizarre, it's weird, it's problematic. So it's an asterisk. But genocide prosecutions are alive and well, and they began before Nuremberg trials, right? Polish national trials. The second project that I'm up to is with my co-PI, Ernesto Verdeja from the University of Notre Dame. This is a small grant from the Stimson Institute. Again, you can do a lot with like $2,000 for Zoom, right? But what we're doing is we're interviewing, the goal of this project is to understand the role of the United Nations Office for Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, the role it plays in sort of the bureaucracy of the UN, and then the global ecosystem of mass atrocity prevention. And to do this, we're interviewing high-level UN officials and bureaucrats working in governments that work with the UN, interviews with civil society members, academics who interface with the office. And part of the reason for the funding is because there's actually like a lot of conflict in the office. So the people who are behind the funding wanted 2 conflict resolution people. Ernesto teaches at Notre Dame Croc School, conflict resolution school. They wanted people from conflict resolution schools who do genocide so that we can make suggestions on how to fix their inter-office problems. That's going to be, we won't share it with this anyway. It's incredible. You think like departmental politics, right? Tough. Like this is the bureaucrat, the internal workplace is insane at this office. But we got a lot of suggestions, but those are all going to be private, and we're going to just pass those off to diplomats, move on with our life. And the things we're going to publish are findings about actually what this office does. And then once we release those, we're going to come back and write about, what this actually means in terms of international institutions in genocide prevention. The third project, and this is my book that I'm writing, which has a terrible title, and I encourage suggestions from anybody. I'm titling this book, Dying in the Age of Thoughtlessness. The global peace building industrial complex. I could have easily titled this something about, sort of a history of Burundi and Cambodia foreign interventions. But the goal of the book here is an overarching goal, which is to bridge 2 worlds: the world of peace building and prevention practitioners, and then those who generate knowledge about it. That's really what I think I'm up to here. And I'm playing around with the Hegelian metaphor. I hope nobody thinks I'm a Hegelian historian is going to come in March and talk about the end of history. That's not what I'm up to. What I'm really kind of intrigued is this allegory that Hegel has, the night all cows are black, which is really discussing the way that we can create these categories for knowing the world that are based on these absolutes. And then we use those to understand the human condition. And when we do that, we lose the ability to draw distinctions between human movements and empirical phenomena. Thus, all cows are black in the night. And there's a kind of, Hegel's got this like idea that this is sort of what happens when cognition is reduced to thoughtlessness. And there's a warning here, which is that if we flatten out human motivations to universal categories, which is actually necessary to do generalizable research in politics and society, we run the danger that all distinctions and differences between empirical phenomena can be erased, and everything appears to be the same. And one of the things I'm arguing is that the peace-building field, which also in my definition includes genocide prevention, mass atrocity prevention, has a lot of knowledge about how to prevent genocides that does exactly this. I first began to think of this when you walk into the UN compound in Bujumbura. So it's disorienting. Burundi's not a hot country. It's hilly, it's cool, but it's, you kind of can't really see it here. These are trailers that are stacked one after another. There's about 40 or 50. And then these have got these little squares here. Those are air conditionings. So you walk in and it's insanely cold and loud. And then you walk past like aluminum siding fortresses, right? With machine guns everywhere. You begin to think, what is this place, right? This is supposed to be the center, the nerve center of this operation for development, conflict resolution, and food assistance in Burundi, heavily fortified. And then you see sticky notes everywhere, right, on walls. And this is, for me, this is funny because when you walk into the development offices, USAID, you see sticky notes everywhere. And that's because intro-level master's classes teach students, right, Quentin, to do conflict analysis using sticky notes. And so sticky notes is how you teach students how to analyze conflicts, because you can move it around as your understanding of conflict and change. And you walk in here and you see sticky notes everywhere, right? There's not a sticky note in the whole country. I mean, good luck finding, you know how expensive sticky notes are, right? They're really pricey. Like you don't, every sticky note in the country is and then there's this whole sort of technocratic apparatus here, right? And you just can't help but think that, is any of this stuff actually building any peace, right? It's a juxtaposition that's really jarring. And so that's where I got this idea of working on this and using this idea. There's another kind of one here. So I had an icebreaker planned, I'll do it now. Pop quiz. Which of these pictures did I copy from the US State Department website, and which did I copy and paste from Al Jazeera? See any hands? Call it out, call it out.
State Department on the left.
State Department on the left, right? Real difficult office. All right, so what's the difference that you see in these two pictures? What are they communicating to you?
You don't get to see the big high wall.
Yeah, the wall's gone. All right, so that flag is this flag. That buttressing here is this buttressing here. The security barrier is not there. Now this here, this is a defensive fortification. And so this is to prevent RPGs from flying into the windows of the embassy. And so you see here, the picture makes it look like it's an architectural flourish. But when you're here, it looks like a fort. Because there's guys up here with machine guns. Right? Now, when you're inside the stat office, it's spooky because it looks like you're in prison. That office also has a swimming pool. It has a fully stocked grocery store. It has apartments where people are living. Because if you work inside that office, you're not allowed out of the embassy compound unless you have permission. And with permission, you can still go only within a 2-block radius that the Marines secure. U.S. government has a treaty with Marines, but the Marines provide security for a 2-block radius within that embassy. So you can only go 2 blocks outside the embassy. So in some ways, it appears like a fortress to those on the outside, but to those on the inside, it's a prison. And so if you're working in UNDP on a development project in the provinces of Burundi, you're not allowed to actually go to see the implementation of your development project. They're not allowed to travel the Burundian countryside. And so picture this as a metaphor of your brand new master's degree, right? You're all excited to get a peace building job. We go build peace, prevent genocide. That's what you have in your mind, right? And then this is the reality that you find. You see this, I'm playing here with the appearances of reality. Right? So for me, that kind of crystallizes a lot of the ways in which we know the world. Think about it. Now, if anything, I'm going to be the job candidate who put a picture of a cow on the slide. So I'll give you something to remember, even if you never see it again. The cow, I'm just being like, right, here come the cows. All cows are black. So the book has 4 theses that I'm working through. The first is that peace building is a global industry, close to $50 billion industry. Now this is nothing compared to the amount of money the nation states spend on war, but it's a lot more than the money coming from private NGOs and philanthropic groups like World Vision, Save the World, Humanity United. And if you told a private venture capital firm that you want to start a business to do grants and implement development projects, they say, well, how big is the industry? Say 50 billion. They say, sure, let's talk. So this industry is grant driven. Now, here's the fun thing: is I don't have to feel so much risk talking about this in an academic position because I'm not going to come back and hit the peer-reviewed literature too hard. This is not a question of the literature that makes it into the peer-reviewed process in academic journals. Something else here. But the industry is grant driven with significant funds to large NGOs, large research one universities, big think tanks, and for-profit development outfits. But this link, if you hit it, we'll go to DT Global. Didn't connect to the Wi-Fi here. DT Global, the investors behind it, it's a for-profit industry. The investors behind it created a small business version so they could compete for the small business grants that the State Department offers to development industries, right? It's astonishing, right? This disadvantages small NGOs and small universities, mind you. They can't afford the internal audit requirements. And it really, really disadvantages local NGOs and local universities that can't get the IRS tax codes or the EU tax codes to receive this money in the first place. So you find a situation where this industry has created dedicated career tracks. Right? Most of the funding goes towards the salary of highly trained experts, who are usually nationals of donor countries and institutional overhead. Right? One of the joys, the absolute joys of being here at IGMAP is that you place your master's students in small NGOs. These are the people that are actually doing the work. Right? It's really, I can't express to you enough how much that means to me. Leave it at that. I got more cows to cover. So the knowledge incentivized by the industry justifies the industry. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, there's huge pressure on these grant writing teams. People have PhDs writing grants. Right? There's huge pressure on grant writing teams to document need and relevance, articulate a theory of change. The theory of change is a teleology. You can't, it's just, this is why this stuff doesn't make it to peer-reviewed literature, right? And then the measured impact, right? Now, this funding incentivizes certain kinds of knowledge, right? Back to universal categories, that we're going to prevent genocide in Burundi, and 3 weeks later, we're going to prevent genocide in over here, and then we're going to do this here, and then we're going to do a community development project in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that we're going to go over here, right? So you get these grant teams that win this, and they work all over the world, right? So they do. And there's a certain kind of knowledge that's required in order to get these grants, right? But then the grants also create a kind of knowledge, because there is this stuff does enter into the peer-reviewed literature sometimes. And it actually is read by people who do dissertations. And it is read by people who are in academia, who then use a lot of this work as a basis for understanding field research, like the first round desk research that you do when you're trying to figure out a dissertation, right? Hit Google and you open up. A lot of this stuff ends up cycling back this way. And what we find is that the research questions, agendas, methods are shaped by funders, either directly or indirectly. The proposals they find. And now we're at a situation where we begin to see that all the dots really are black. The world is consistent and manageable with self-evident technocratic solutions for world peace. And better still, that we have trained the technocrats who can do this. And this thing that I'm just going through, like going through these requests for proposals, but then also the metrics for success, this is the most incredible part. Success is not defined by whether or not you actually achieve your theory of change. It's measured by whether or not you actually implemented your project. This is incredible, right? I mean, because if you measured success, whether or not the theory of change worked, you wouldn't have any success, because the theory of change is a simplistic tautology that collapses the world into simple cause and effect, right? You can never actually achieve your theory of change. You just do your project and it's successful if it's implemented well, right? That's really, for me, kind of a fascinating thing. Now, in the book project, I trace the evolution of the concept of peace building and peace and then institutional forms, the same way I did with genocide. In the previous book. And then I go and I trace the curriculum that's out there to train these professionals, right? The U.S. Institute of Peace is the Gandhi King Global Academy, right? And this is, you all can take the introduction to peace building curriculum, right? And then the UN peace building has an orientation curriculum, right, that's out there. Oops. And then you see that kind of borders on dangerous as I actually go and I look at course curriculum that's out there, right, in major places that train people. So University of Chicago, you see my own Carter School, it's pretty dangerous. We have a concentration of peace building in our curriculum, where we have a whole class on monitoring and evaluation, conflict assessment, program design. Notre Dame. I could have easily put slides here for the George Washington University, American University, Georgetown, right? There's a whole sort of world out there doing this. So, I mean, there we go, okay. So the book is kind of layered in 3 parts. The one is my read of the industry, the knowledge it demands and creates. And then I take a look at critical peace building literature, genocide studies, and peace building. And I have here, yeah, there we go. Instead of giving you a bibliography, I copied and pasted all night last week. It's a visual representation. I'm calling Vinny a shadow peace builder. There's an entire literature out there about shadow peace builders, which are the people who actually move within conflict zones and organize movements in their own societies, which the international community has an incentive to use, but then not give credit to. And credit then goes to the technocrats who are there. And so there's a whole literature out there which is re-understanding the Bosnia and so the whole former Yugoslavian conflicts through these understandings that great powers actually did very little to promote peace. These movements were the shadow peace builders. So that's a literature that I'm relying on heavily. And I'm trying to pull out Cambodian scholars and then scholars from the African Great Lakes region to be the people who I rely on for writing history of these regions. And then the third sort of intellectual aspect of the book is that I mapped that against my 10 years of experience in Burundi and Cambodia. So, how am I doing on time? All right. So for Burundi, there's part of my history of Burundi is trying to understand and explain that the way Burundians view identities is very, very different than the way the words that are available in French and English, nationalities, ethnicities, my goodness, races. And so I'm tracing Burundian historians and Rwandan historians who write about these concepts. And you can see the way that the literature in English and French switches from calling Hutu and Tutsi races to calling them ethnicities. And really, that doesn't really match up in Kirundi. There's not a neat link there to these concepts. So there's a whole school of scholars from these regions that the closest word you have in English is the word caste. That's contested too. And so I put a star here, because I got a little star that comes back later. Evariste Ngamikita is the former dean of the University of Burundi. He's also a major figure in the Rwanda political party. And over the course of several months, I was asking him, you keep changing your book every few years. And finally, there was enough trust that was built up, and he explained to me that, yeah, I changed the book over the years as the conflict in Burundi was changing. So he rewrites his history book and changes the history book. Now, this becomes a tricky part. I was talking to people earlier or throughout the day about sort of how people tell you things that are astonishing that you don't know how you can ethically write. I'm trying to figure out how to do this, but this particular historian is the major political figure in armed wing of the UPRONA party, which is a Tutsi majority party. He pretty much commands whole artillery bases around right? He has those under his command, which means faculty meetings would be quite interesting, right? But more importantly, history and politics are one, right? And after speaking with him for getting to know him really well, I asked him specifically about how he consistently redefines the Tutsis as races and ethnicities. And he said, well, Doug, you have to keep up with the Holocaust literature. So what do you mean by that? He said, because when we write of the Tutsis as being the Jews of Africa, we get grant funding, right? And then you go back, and then you go to the Hutu power parties, right? And they too are playing this. Now there's a whole literature, the critical peace-building literature, which goes back to the kind of a political arrogance that happens, where people in conflicts become experts at playing great powers off each other, right? And Alan Cooperman is a person who really solidifies this portion of the literature, but people become experts in this, positioning themselves to solicit foreign intervention on their behalf, playing narratives, right? And this actually is a really important part of politics all around the world. And so, the thing is, I don't know how to write about that without exposing, I'm sort of trying to figure out how to navigate this. But it's alive and real. And so the thesis of the book then around this chapter is coming to this argument that global movements for genocide prevention, international law, human rights, and peace converged in very, very insidious ways in 2016 to actually create incentives for violence in Burundi. And what I mean by that is the following. So you had, in 2015, this extraordinary outburst of media around genocide. That's right, genocide, ethnic conflict. And the research that Vinny and I did, we did the complicated to explain, but we were leading dialogue between party leaders and generals. We had the buy-in of every single one of the rebel leaders because we were funded by the Swiss, and that was diplomatically appropriate. And then there was this national dialogue process that had collapsed and wasn't working. And this I need to really be clear here. This is Lou, who's Burundian, who's navigating this. I'm just sort of tagging along to some degree for the ride. Vinny had this idea of the national dialogue was a disaster. Even the government that was backing it didn't like it. So why not have a national dialogue about why the national dialogue doesn't work? if you could get people to talk about how terrible this dialogue is, that becomes a dialogue. And there's this model in conflict resolution called problem-solving workshops that you use from track-2 diplomacy all the way to dysfunctional families and neighbors who are fighting on condo boards. And the idea there is that if you can convince people to treat their conflicts as problems that they need to solve, to make the mental leap like that towards viewing themselves as partners, not competitors. And Vinny pulled this off. And that peace process, that dialogue is what he handed over to the team of Kenyan-backed mediators, which became the basis for really incredible progress in Burundi that's right now just finding kind of, there's a lot of going back to the line. So, anyway. In the process, we did 490 interviews across the whole country over a span of several years, focus groups. And these, we very much conceive these as oral histories in a lot of ways. We didn't ask people scripted questions. And this is what the dialogues look like. Have volleyball tournaments, right? And then you had the kids from the opposing parties would play volleyball against each other. Volleyball in the south, basketball in the north. Different regions of Burundi, different sports. And then the dialogues happened along the side. And the proof that there is a universal art form called the selfie is that when you hand kids who are, teenagers your cell phone, they take selfies. So I found that picture on my phone when I kind of fun selfies. So our finding, I want to sort of brush past this, I don't need to go into this, but what we had found was actually that there was a tremendous amount of political posturing in this conflict that the peace building genocide prevention industry was not understanding. The diplomats weren't grasping it. What they had completely failed to see is that these two were the parties that fought the Civil War. Tutsi party, Tutsi party. And then in the peace process, this usurper party emerged, which was an inter-ethnic party, the CNDD-FDD. Now this party is, this is not a model for human rights. When we're talking about anti-gay legislation, it's just draconian murdering of political dissidents. But there was a part of their ideology which was powerful, which is that we are an inter-group party, Hutus and Tutsis make us up. And in so doing, they presented themselves as a genocide prevention party. And they were actually working with the U.S. Special Advisor on Genocide Prevention to refresh the laws against genocide in their own domestic constitution. Now, what happens when the genocide prevention industry sort of descends and people start talking about it, money starts to flow. Well, that money gets picked up by the groups that have an incentive. These groups, they lost their rural core. The rural core, they became hollowed out in a lot of ways. The party's gone. And so there was an incentive here for people here, in these two parties, to begin to create ethnic violence and foster it. And we had figured out that a coalition emerged with the extremists, I wouldn't say extremists, but sort of the wing that wanted violence from Front-Lebu and the wing that wanted violence from Ukraine actually started to work together to assassinate people inside the other party and their own party, try to break apart that coalition. So the violence wasn't ethnic violence. The violence was something different, which only appeared to the West as ethnic. Go back to the night when Holocaust happened. Now the scholars who studied Burundi knew this, but not the development industry. So I'm at 45 minutes according to my clock here. I have some things on Cambodia. My essential takeaway thesis for Cambodia is that the post-genocide justice process in Cambodia places an extraordinary amount of emphasis on justice, and that creates a space for the international community to overlook extraordinary structural violence and human rights violations. I'm thinking about linking this with Rwanda, because in Cambodia and Rwanda, you see governments that manipulate international law because they use it to control the judiciary. So the courts in Cambodia produce judges that are highly trained, appear to the West to be proper legal judges. But to get into the court, you have to be a party loyalist. And so what happens is that the judges that are then pushed out of the court are the elite judges in the country, the party loyalists. And these are the judges that go through, on a case-by-case basis, make rulings on land theft, on expropriation of resources. And so you see this incredible system of environmental degradation playing out in the court system of Cambodia. And it's party politics, it's corrupt. And it's got everything to do with the court system that actually legitimizes these judges and puts them into place. And that, I think you can also see that in Rwanda, in particular, manipulation of the justice process for political purposes. So I'm tempted to sort of make Cambodia and Rwanda chapter 5. Anyway, that's, I'm open for suggestions. So the question then is, what should we teach our students? Well, Holocaust education has a really, really smart observation. This is sort of taking us core. Portraying all individuals, including victims and perpetrators, as human beings who are capable of moral judgment and independent decision making. This is something that was the first thesis on ethical Holocaust education that the Mandel Center at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum articulated. Second, people who risk their lives to rescue victims of Nazi oppression provide compelling role models for students, but given that only a small fraction of non-Jews under Nazi occupation helped rescue Jews, an overemphasis on heroic actions can result in inaccurate, unbalanced account of history. Similarly, in exposing students to the worst aspects of human nature, as revealed in the history of the Holocaust, you run the risk of fostering cynicism in your students. Accuracy of fact, together with balanced perspective on history, is necessary. So my question is, if this is part of Holocaust education, why can't this be part of genocide prevention education? So we should teach our students to be skeptical of sentimentality, of romanticizing the heroic deeds of genocide prevention. But we should also do it in a way that doesn't allow us to collapse into the total pit of the, well, none of this matters. Right? Because there are success stories, and before I push send on this book, I need to make sure that I flag them and highlight them. Right? Secondly, I think there has to be ethical reflection in this field on who is going to benefit from external intervention. And I think that's an important professional skill. I think that's actually how you do a conflict assessment. Who's going to benefit by my conflict resolution? And who will my conflict resolution work disadvantage? And that has everything to do with whose good counts as good. We need to ask that question. Right? 3, viewing genocide as an event is problematic. It leads to, it's easy for say, well, genocide is mass murder. But wait a second, what about all those processes that lead to this point in the first place? So why, if we understand genocide as a, let's see, the law in genocide pushes us to see it as a crime and therefore an action, right? So let's crack open genocide as a social process, because when you view it as an act, it's easy to say, oh, that's a bad act, therefore the people who do it are bad, therefore the victims are good. And now you're in good guys and bad guys mode. And the danger here is that students really like to be good guys. And so they go through genocide prevention class and they think, now we're gonna be the good guys. It doesn't work like that. And I think it leads easy solutions to genocide. Hence, and it sorts people into this dichotomy that I don't think is very helpful. Instead, I think genocide should be viewed as a process, a conflict process, where the solutions we think are obvious aren't really causes. Right? And that's where ethical reflection comes back in. Again, I'm sort of at a point here where, knowing your curriculum, I'm in some ways kind of preaching to a choir, right, that idiom. But you should also know how rare that perspective is, how cutting edge it is. And then finally, I think we should help students recognize the incentives that are driving this industry. I think we need to own them and be aware of them. I think that's really vital for actually achieving the purpose of, do we actually want to prevent genocide? Well, yes, then we need to pay attention to the people who are funding us and why they're funding us and what they want out of it. Right. So that's the end. I see I got all these slides on Lumpkin. I'm very happy to indulge people. With that, thank you.
No other questions?
I think, don't you want me to say, you know, take it.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. That makes, I think, most of us feel like we need to get out of our office a little bit more. Good question. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned there was a lot of forgetting work in Holocaust studies. I think you touched on it in the third part of your book about problematic to see genocide as an event. I wonder if you could give an example or two about what has been forgotten about given Holocaust studies and at what cost.
Yeah, the cost part is interesting. So Lemkin gets picked up in the very first issue of the International Association's Genocide Scholars Journal, Genocide Studies and Prevention. Lemkin makes small appearances in the Journal of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, but those appearances are really more towards comparative genocide studies. Instead, what you find is when the first generations of Holocaust scholars who engage Lemkin, I might say that Ian Kershaw and Stephen Katz were the first to take him seriously. Maybe I might have really made a big mistake here and left somebody out, but that was done under the assumption that Lemkin was sloppy in his definitions. And what he really meant was to associate genocide with the attempt to exterminate a group. And what is extermination except physical killing? So there's so Dirk Moses has a very Dirk way. For those of you who are familiar with Dirk, it's a Dirk way of like poking people. He describes the first generation of Holocaust scholars as disengaging with Lemkin, and when they did, proceeding to lecture Lemkin on a concept that he himself invented. Right? And that's a way of saying that this conception of genocide. So Axis Rule in Occupied Europe is published at the same time that the public is getting the first pictures of Auschwitz, right, and the entire camp system in fact, and because it coincides with liberation of camps. And there's a public discourse out there that's using Axis Rule to understand the images of Holocaust camps, right? The death camps, the concentration camps. And so there's a natural association that's made in public discourse between these two words. And when you go back and you sort of read Lemkin, what's all this stuff about like national feelings, right? You said extermination, right? You say, well, you're being sloppy with your terms. But in the Polish versions of Lemkin's writings, and especially when you get into the Yiddish definitions, it starts to make sense, right? Of what a nation is. It's a different thing than the French and American definition of nationalism. An entirely different thing. So one way I like to say this is that if you're reading Lemkin and you read the word nation and you have in your mind French Revolution, you've got the wrong idea of a nation, right? It's not what Lemkin's talking about. And I have a feeling that there's a lot of this is sort of not much of a willingness to because Lemkin is a really sloppy philosopher in a lot of ways. He doesn't write clearly in a social scientific way. Comes across his legal briefs. Doesn't take the time to actually explain what he means by nation, right? So there's a way that historians read Lemkin's book. Doesn't really make sense to them. They say, well, you said nations and you said extermination, but wait a second, you're confused in your concept. So I think that's a real thing, right? Which is how you get beginning like 1970s with the emergence of Holocaust memory. That's sort of the criticism starts to grow. The figures associated with this are taking Lemkin in this way. And it's not until you get to the 80s, and in a very interesting way, Yehuda Bauer becomes the first one who actually explains this to people, right? It's comparative genocide models. So that's not a good answer. I wouldn't be prepared to write that up and send it to a journal. But it's an interesting kind of conceptual thing. Then there's the other part of it, which is that Lemkin is his definition of genocide. He's talking about things like colonization, right? And Holocaust studies never really brought colonization in until there's a collection of historians around Dirk Moses and Dan Stone, and actually Wendy Lauer in an interesting way. And I think once that happens, once there's that question of what really was Hitler up to in the East, then the question of colonization comes back in, and those historians read Lemkin and immediately grasp Lemkin's relevance. So that's another aspect of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the lovely talk. I was wondering, in the section of your book where you're talking about peace building curriculum, I was wondering if you have any explicit critiques or recommendations that you're planning on including for those programs to better develop their curriculum to reflect some of the findings in your book.
Yeah, that's the, so, you know, like the spirit of renewal is sort of underneath this. I'm just, again, I'm just in line, I'm trying to not, I don't wanna tear people down. I just don't think that's a nice way to live life. What I am really, the fact that, so these curriculum, they haven't changed since the 90s. And that's interesting to think about. And because, you know, some of them are state universities, and to change the curriculum, you need state approval, right? So it's a lot easier to create new classes, but not change existing ones, which is a bizarre kind of thing happens in a lot of the states. It's a lot of work, curriculum, you gotta get people together. And so there's this thing that's happening, which I'm kind of like lucky, which is that a lot of these course objectives and course goals and course descriptions, and then therefore approaches, which get tied into curriculums created by people who retired long ago. And I can get away with a lot there, right? Because I can say the world has changed, right? I can offer it. So that's one aspect of it. But in terms of positive contributions, you know, this is also a critique to the people who fund this work too, right? Because the curriculum in some degree is out there to try to help this master's students get jobs in these industries. I mean, 60% of all students who go to the Carter School end up with career, right? That's a huge, huge part of why you go to the Carter School. The Elliott School, Georgetown University is even higher, right? University is high. And so there's a degree to which these curriculum they come back and say, well, we are teaching what the employers want. And guess what? The State Department requires a conflict analyst to be on every single development project. There has to be a conflict analysis section. There has to be a gender inclusivity assessment. So before you build a bridge, wherever you're building it, you have to do a conflict assessment and a gender inclusivity assessment. The gender inclusivity assessment is just as shallow and just as empty as the conflict assessment, right? It's literally, was there a woman involved in the planning? That's literally it, right? which is, when you think about that, that hollows out what we mean by gender inclusivity, right? And so there's a kind of way that these students are taught how to do that, right? And then once they're taught how to do that, they come away with that as technical knowledge. So I actually have a sort of a lot of space to begin to say, well, you know, actually the Foreign Service Institute's training is radically different than the training that's happening in these universities. This was an incredible learning opportunity. We created elements of our simulation, and what do you do when your own president issues a tweet undercuts 15 years of your work? What do you do when that office of the government is competing with your office of the government for different foreign policy things, and one branch of the US government is actually creating a conflict that your office is not assigned to deal with, right? So we created conflicts within. So most of our conflicts in our genocide prevention simulation were not conflicts that were happening in the world. It was conflicts that were happening within the US government over how to respond, right? And then the policy people are different than the development people. And so the diplomats, the people who are in the streets as negotiators, the mediators, these people do not touch the development work. And so therefore they have very, very little invested in what the development grants actually require the experts to do. And so they don't care. And so that offers me an opportunity to come back and say, well, wait a second, you're training your diplomats sometimes the exact opposite skills that you're requiring your civil servants who enter into the bureaucracy to have, right? So your foreign service officers and your civil servants have opposite skills, right? And maybe these universities should align them and start teaching the civil servants the skills that you're teaching the diplomats, right? And so that's how I avoid the temptation of pure mean curmudgeon, right? But then also offering concrete things like, okay, so if you're going to do monitoring and evaluation, sure, you need to do this to get the grants, but you had better have a mechanism for understanding the conflicts that you created as a process of this, understanding how you're going to deal with them. That makes sense.
So I really enjoyed this very, very much. And you mentioned how Lemke puts us in a colonial context, right? That's where genocide comes from. But there was an irony that struck me as you were talking about all this peace building, because it also is occurring in a colonial context.
That's right.
Right? And so if you think about all this literature that talks about how this functions, you know, empires construct the other that they then say, and this is a way that in which they mask themselves to what is really a colonial relationship. Yeah, so I'm wondering now, as you think about solutions, is the solution to prioritize local knowledge? Or is that too complicated now because of the way in which they're implicated in these international mechanisms? I'm wondering, as you analyze this, where do you think?
Yeah, and how do you know you've actually got local knowledge, right?
Right.
Because there's a whole field of this literature that's like, the people you call locals are really experts in the fact that you fly in for a 2-week study for them leave, right? They're really good. There's a whole job sector in Burma, in Myanmar, that's people actually refer to as test. By that they mean they do surveys for Western people. So and then there's outfits that connect you with surveys. So if you're doing a PhD, right, you do a big survey of Burundi, there's a local organization that will find surveys for you. And they actually hire people who are experts at answering surveys. So, and that's that, it's you don't even know if you've actually tapped into what is local, right? That's a dilemma. So the industry